So throughout this series we've looked at most of the characters and the themes that they inhabit. We've looked at Jonathan as an archetypal Victorian rational man. We've looked at Mina and Lucy and the different kinds of womanhood that they embody, and also their relationship to truth. And we explored this idea that in the world of Dracula, the truth is something that is on the side of good and that saves the characters, while being kept in lies and shadow is something that kills them. And we look at how the vampires, whether it's Dracula or his brides, contain pagan forces, whereas the human characters are either on the side of Christianity or reason. And in this video I wanted to look mainly on the characters on the side of reason. So we're going to be looking at Dr. Seward and Van Helsing. But these two characters, while they're both men of science, are very different. Dr. Seward is limited by his scientific mindset, whereas Van Helsing is much broader minded, and I'll argue that he actually synthesizes pretty much all of the characteristics in this story, which makes him the ultimate hero. Part 1. Dr. Seward, a man of science. In many ways, Dr. Seward plays a similar role in the story to the role that Jonathan played at Castle Dracula. Both men are Victorian middle-class men who are ultimately men of science and bound by the typical norms of Victorian England. But more than Jonathan, Dr. Seward is truly a man of science and reason. Seward runs a mental institution, and one of his main troublesome patients is the insane Mr. Renfield, who Seward diagnoses as having a condition called zoophagia, which is a condition that basically means that he wants to consume animals and life. Now, Dr. Seward, quite naturally, is disposed to look for scientific, reasonable explanations for the strange occurrences in Renfield. I questioned him more fully than I had ever done, with a view to making myself master of the facts of his hallucination. Dr. Seward and his particular scientific strand of reason can be seen as part of a demystification of reality, which is something that began arguably with the Enlightenment and carried on as science progressed. It's the idea that all of the mystical explanations that we used to have for the strange things in nature are being taken away and taken over by science, resulting in this demystification. And so when a scientist like Dr. Seward sees something strange, he's always going to be looking for a scientific explanation rather than a supernatural one. And this, ultimately for him, is his vice. Seward always wants rational explanations for what Renfield is doing and saying, and this means that he's unable to connect the dots between Renfield's strange behaviour, which grows more strange throughout the story, and the Count and his doings. Perhaps the most telling scene for the reader, where we start to think that maybe there is some connection between Renfield and Dracula, but Seward does not, is when Renfield escapes the mental asylum and he's caught by Dr. Seward and he is completely raving mad. "I am here to do your bidding, master. I am your slave, and you will reward me, for I shall be faithful. I have worshipped you long and afar off. Now that you are near, I await your commands, and you will not pass me by, will you, dear master, in your distribution of good things?" When Dr. Seward learns of Dracula, his mystical powers and his control that he can have over people, he fails to make any connection between the kind of things that Renfield is saying and the Count. And this is despite the fact that Renfield's behaviour becomes more erratic and more suspect as the novel progresses. So in a sense, Dr. Seward is just completely blinded by his own rationality and his need to seek scientific explanations. Van Helsing offers a perfect summation of Dr. Seward's flaw and the flaw of this limited, scientific, rational perspective. "You are a clever man, friend John. You reason well and your wit is bold, but you are too prejudiced. You do not let your eyes see nor your ears hear, and that which is outside of your daily life is not of account to you. Do you not think that there are things which you cannot understand, and yet which are, that some people see things that others cannot? But there are things old and new which must not be contemplated by men's eyes, because they know, or they think they know, some things which other men have told them. Ah, it is a fault of our science that it wants to explain all, and if it explain not, then it says there is nothing to explain." Part 2. Van Helsing. Now, Van Helsing is also a man of science, but he is different from Seward in many different ways. And I think the best place to understand Van Helsing and the way that he differs from Dr. Seward is to look at his introduction in the story, which comes in a letter form when Seward is writing to Arthur Holmwood and telling him that he wants to invite Van Helsing to England to help them understand Lucy's condition. "I have written to my old friend, Professor Van Helsing of Amsterdam, who knows about as much as obscure diseases as anyone in the world. He is a seemingly arbitrary man, but this is because he knows what he is talking about better than anyone else. He is a philosopher and a metaphysician, and one of the most advanced scientists of his day, and he has, I believe, an absolutely open mind. This, with an iron nerve, a temper of the ice brook, an indomitable resolution, self-command and toleration exalted from virtues to blessings, and the kindliest and truest heart that beats, these form the equipment for the noble work that he is doing for mankind. Work both in theory and practice, for his view is as wide as his all-embracing sympathy. What's interesting about Van Helsing here is that just as much as he is a man of science, he's also a man of intuition and instinct, which is something that is completely alien to Dr. Seward, who's always seeking an explanation for what's going on and would never follow mere intuition alone. His knowledge also spans many fields. He's not just contained within the narrow forms of mechanistic scientific thinking and logic, he's also a philosopher, he's also doing metaphysics, he's got a broad knowledge of the occult. At one part we even find out that he's also a lawyer. He pretty much does everything. And now that might sound strange, but actually if you go back far enough, you do find that men of science or philosophers used to actually engage in many different professions. It was possible to be both a philosopher, an engineer, a scientist, a biologist, all of these things. And unlike Dr. Seward, whose mind is completely closed to mysticism and the occult, Van Helsing has a completely open mind. Later in the story, when Van Helsing and Dr. Seward are discussing Lucy, Dr. Seward says this of how Van Helsing is responding in the conversation. His reply was characteristic of him, for it was logical and forceful and mysterious. Again, there's this element of mystery to Van Helsing. He's not just talking about facts and logical explanations for things. He's opening his mind up to what's really going on, which in this case is that there's a vampire. And this is what allows Van Helsing to realise that the blood transfusions, the method by which they're trying to save Lucy, isn't enough. They can't just rely on this. They can keep pumping her full of blood, but Dracula is going to keep coming back and taking that blood away. The only way that he can protect Lucy is to actually put garlic in the room and to engage with the vampire law and all of the magic surrounding that. Obviously, this doesn't work out for Van Helsing, because as much as he is the hero of the story, as much as he might seem like he's perfect in every way with all of these different specialisms, he does have one fatal flaw, and that's the way that he treats Lucy. As we mentioned in other videos, Van Helsing decides to keep Lucy in the dark about her condition and about the vampires, and this sadly leads to her mother taking the garlic out of her room, which allows Dracula to come in the room and leads to Lucy's death. Part 3. The Power of Truth. In previous episodes, I've talked about how truth is a big theme in Dracula, and I noted that the characters in Dracula who are kept in the dark, such as Lucy and her mother, often suffer terrible fates, such as death or becoming a vampire themselves. Now in this video, I've talked about Van Helsing, and I've noted that he seems to contain all of these different forces, these pagan forces, these rational forces, these Christian forces, and he combines them into one big synthesis, and that makes him the heart and the hero of the story. And another thing that Van Helsing does with all of this is that he is essentially the light that brings forth the truth to all of the characters, or at least most of them. It's through him that the other characters' eyes are opened up to the mystical nature of the world, and that they also find some solace in that they're not afraid like Jonathan was in the castle when he thought about what was happening to him. One of the things that happens to Jonathan while he's in Castle Dracula and he becomes more and more afraid is that he starts to doubt things. He starts to doubt his convictions to reason, to truth, and even reality. At one point he even says that he prefers being asleep to waking. When Lucy is turned into a vampire, she essentially is locked into this dream world now, where all of her worst characteristics come to the fore and she can't control them. In the world of Dracula, the world of dreams is an important place because we can find important things there, but left unconstrained, it's also a dangerous place. It obscures us from reality and truth, and that is something that ultimately leads to our damnation or death. What saves Jonathan and what condemns Lucy is reality and truth. Lucy, kept in the dark, sinks into this undead dream world, but Jonathan, when he returns to England and discovers what really happened to him and has all of his beliefs about what happened to him confirmed by the Count, is truly liberated. Here is Jonathan writing in his diary again for the first time since returning to England and learning what happened. I never thought to write in this diary again, but the time has come. When I got home last night, Mina had supper ready, and when we had supped she told me of Van Helsing's visit, and of her having given him the 2 diaries copied out, and of how anxious she had been about me. She showed me in the doctor's letter that all I wrote down was true. It seemed to have made a new man of me. It was the doubt as to the reality of the whole thing that knocked me over. I felt impotent, and in the dark distrustful. But now that I know, I am not afraid, even of the Count. The truth, brought out by Van Helsing in his letters, restores Jonathan back to his former self. But of course he's also changed. He's not the same person that he was before. He's not the kind of guy that's going to go back to Transylvania and mock and patronise the people with their silly superstitions. He's opened up to that spiritual Christian world, and that has been liberating for him. Like all the survivors by the end of the story, Jonathan is enlightened by the spiritual, pagan and Christian forces, and he's able to integrate them into himself and with his reason. It's not that Van Helsing is against reason and truth, it's just that he realises that in order to understand the truth, you have to open up your mind to other things. And the problem is that with the scientific rationality mode of thinking, you're limiting yourself off, you're narrow, and this allows these dark forces to come in and take over. I'll end this episode and this series with another quote from Van Helsing, which I think perfectly sums up the themes that I'm talking about here. It shows the importance of combining both reason and faith together in trying to understand the world. And in my view, this is pretty much the fundamental principle of the novel. My thesis is this: I want you to believe. To believe in what? To believe in things which you cannot. Let me illustrate. I heard once of an American who so defined faith: that which enables us to believe things which we know to be untrue. For one, I follow that man. He meant that we shall have an open mind, and not let a little bit of truth check the rush of a big truth, like a small rock does a railway truck. We get the small truth first. Good. We keep him, and we value him. But all the same, we must not let him think himself all the truth in the universe. Alright, that is it for this episode and the conclusion of the Dracula's Reader's Guide series. Let me know what you think about my thoughts from this video, and also just in general of the series overall. I will be doing another Reader's Guide series. Hopefully I won't leave it as long this time as I did between this one and Wuthering Heights. But yeah, hopefully it will be coming soon. Haven't decided what book yet, so if you have ideas, put them in the comments. One person mentioned Frankenstein, which, might do that one soon. Maybe not next, but I think that one is going to come up at some point. But yeah, any suggestions in the comments, let me know. Otherwise, take care everyone. Ta-ra.